How's it going, man?
It's going good. It's going good. It's so good to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to read your book and to be in conversation with you. I mean, there's so many different places to begin, but I mean, I just think back to the first time that I met you at Daybreak Star, the powwow in July 2023. It was like a month or two before we filmed our film on a powwow, and which you appear. And so I've been watching you dance for the past 2 years in the same like 30-minute take as I'm editing this film, and it's really nice to see you and to have you part of the work that I've done, and I'm so honored to be here in conversation with you. I mean, the first thing I think about is actually when I was looking at the cover of the book, just the Tommy Orange quote on the bottom that he's been waiting for a book like this to be written for a long time. And when I read that, I felt the exact same way. This is such a beautiful and profound book. I mean, I guess just to start, do you want to talk a little bit like how the project came to be? I mean, it feels like it's touched on a few different of the projects that you're working on, but what was the inception of this, or how did it begin?
Well, the inception of it is in part due to actually my publicist who's in the room. There's a lot of ways. I mean, the origins of things, you could kind of identify the origin anywhere. I mean, like, it's a story about my whole life, so, maybe it's my mom and dad's fault. But about 5 years ago, the woman who's actually now my publicist, there's so many ways in which this is such a full circle moment. Jordan Rodman reached out to me and my agent about whether I'd be interested in writing a book. And she was with a different press at that moment in time, but that kicked off a process wherein I wrote a proposal and then ended up writing a book for a different publishing house where she's now my publicist. So there's like a full circle thing in there. But I would say that the real sort of origin of the book in its sort of present form was I made a very unusual decision about 4-ish years ago after living on the East Coast for a decade. I lived in Washington, D.C. at the time. Actually, shout out to some people I know from D.C. I decided to move in with my dad. At 28, I was a bachelor who'd been living for a decade on the East Coast. And my dad left me and my mom and our family when I was about 6 years old. And at the time when I moved in, he still owed me the money that I had loaned him to come to my own high school graduation. So we had a bit of history, suffice it to say. And I made the very unusual decision to move back in with this guy who I hadn't lived with since I was 6 for 22 years. And so suddenly we were living across the hallway from each other. And my dad's an artist. And so he'd be out in the garage carving all day, and I'd be at my laptop trying to figure out how to write a book and how to make a movie all day. And while I was doing the research for We Survived the Night, I had this basic idea that the mythology of my own people would make some sort of appearance in the text. I thought it might be like some sort of ornamentation. And as I was hanging out with my dad and reading the sort of greatest body of oral histories from my people's culture, the Coyote Stories, I started to notice that the Coyote Stories were about this guy who abandoned his kids, who was this incredible creator and destroyer, who had all these wonderful contradictions and yet was incredibly charismatic and shaped the world. And I was hanging out with my dad and I was like, man, like, these stories really remind me of my old man, And at night I would hang out with him and I'd turn on my recorder on my iPhone and just ask him questions about his life. And it became very clear to me that the Coyote Stories way back when, which we considered, by the way, always to be nonfiction, were part of our way of accounting for the guys like my dad in our lives, in our communities, in our families, and the way that they shape our families and our lives and our world. And that sort of realization really transformed the whole book. Because if folks have seen Sugarcane, I was working on this documentary at the same time that was about the system that had annihilated almost entirely my people's entire way of being, our culture, our language, all this sort of stuff. And so if you're working on a film that's about why your people have lost almost everything, and then you're writing a book at the same time, you start to ask, what traditions, what pieces of our culture do I have a responsibility as a storyteller to bring back to life? And so I had this kind of out there idea to try to write the entire book in the tradition, the style, the structure of a Coyote Story, something that I'd never seen done in narrative nonfiction before, to try to help bring back these incredibly beautiful ideas and this sensibility that I saw in these stories that are all but dead in my own family and my own people's lives. You know, I've only heard somebody tell a Coyote Story out loud once in my entire life, and it was actually my uncle who gave me the drum, who I was singing on tonight, and he died like 5 years ago. So this is very much a tradition that is like on life support, at least in my neck of the Indian woods.
No, yeah, I mean, the structure of it is so fascinating and so beautiful, the way that it weaves together, I guess, as it's described, you know, like memoir, reportage, and myth. And even you saying, too, that, you know, these are not fiction. You know, this is real in these different ways. It helps blur the lines between those boundaries that are imposed on how to understand our own myths and our own histories. I mean, like, can you talk a bit about that? Just like the sort of the memoiristic approach, the sort of reporting that you do, or just looking at these things going around the country and around Canada that affect Native peoples, and along with the pairing of the myth or of these Coyote stories.
You know, I think that the reason why I was always interested in figuring out what the story of Native people was because of that, you know, break in my family that was really formative for me. You know, the truth of the matter is that my father is First Nations man. He's fully Secwépemc and St'at'imc, and my mother is a Irish Jewish New Yorker. And if you heard her talk, like she sounds it. You know, my cousins on my native side are like, man, when your mom talks, it sounds like it's on the TV. Which is true. And, you know, so I had this experience of my dad was like this epic Native artist figure. I mean, he was, when I was a little kid, I remember when he was photographed for the cover of Native People's magazine wearing a backwards Kangol hat and purple rock star shades. Like this dude was like a bit of a figure, you know? And he had that last name, NoiseCat. And so, you know, after he left, here I was, and, you know, if me and my dad and my mom posed for a family photo, it would look like my dad's jeans kicked my mom's jeans ass. And, you know, I had his last name, and then he was gone at a very formative age of your consciousness. And so I think I was always trying to figure out who he was and what the identity was that he connected me to, the culture, you know, my family back home in Cannon Lake, which was over 1,000 miles away from where I grew up in Oakland, California, an American city, you know, on a Canadian Indian reservation. And so, you know, I think that I was always kind of interested in trying to figure out the broader story of Native people and of my people to try to figure myself out, and then vice versa, to try to figure myself out, to try to figure out, you know, what the story of our people was. And eventually that led me to, you know, reading and writing. When I was a little kid, I remember like devouring every single Sherman Alexie book that I could get my hands on. When I was like 12 years old, there was like a book report I wrote where I wrote Sherman Alexie fan fiction, like in his style. And in my version of the story, it was like set in the future. And I can't remember which it was, but like it was all the Indians were looking back at photos of ourselves when we were either skinny or back when we were like big. That was like the whole premise of the story. And, you know, like I think that is just something that I've always been driven by. And that ultimately led me to become, you know, a journalist who for whichever newspaper or magazine would like pay me to do it, which is not that many of them, I would travel across Indian country, wherever in Canada there was a story to tell, wherever in the United States there was a story to tell, to try to get at what it is to be Native and why those stories matter to more people than just us.
Yeah, I mean, can you tell me a little bit more about some of those stories? I don't know. Like, I mean, they seem. They seem so informative as a way to read the book. You know, just it's bringing like these myths to contemporary moments, you know, which you do personally with your understanding your father through the lens of Coyote. And what made you choose the certain communities that you went to that you included in the book, or the stories around them?
I mean, on the most basic level, I think that one of the wonderful things about being a writer is that you get to go out and observe people's lives, which is so crazy to me that like people will just talk to me because I'm a reporter or whatever. Like I can put a recorder in their face and they'll just start telling me their story. Like what a magic trick, you know? But I think that I was always drawn to stories that I personally found really complicated and interesting and that felt revealing in some sort of way about an aspect of contemporary Native life that illuminated something about what it is to be Indigenous today, which most people probably assume is like not that interesting of a thing, or just sort of some sort of poster child of, you know, people who live at the bottom of every statistical measurement of misery, but that is actually, like, I think, a very vibrant, complicated, beautiful world. And you know, again, I was drawn to the parts of this that I did not know about yet and that were super interesting to me. So the first like truly reported sort of section of the book tells the story about a tribe in North Carolina, for example, the Lumbee tribe, that I had not really heard of their story until, I mean, like I'd met some Lumbee people at powwows because there's a lot of Lumbee people. They're the most populous tribe east of the Mississippi River, and they can really sing and dance, I should say. If you want to look up anything after this, look up War Paint, this drum group that was just singing at the Black Hills powwow. They're like really badass singers. These are Lumbee guys. And so I was interested in their story because it's so interesting and complicated. Like, so they, first of all, they trace their ancestry to the lost colony of Roanoke. They count the lost colony of Roanoke among some of their ancestors. Just to jog everyone's memory, because I didn't remember what the lost colony of Roanoke was when I set out to report the story either. The lost colony of Roanoke is the first English settlement in what is now North America. And it's considered lost because not many years after the colony was established, the people who sponsored the colony and their family like came looking for them in what was then called Virginia, but is now North Carolina, and the colony was gone. And so this created this sort of set of mysteries around what the heck had happened to this first group of English people who had settled in North America. In the 1800s, that mythology became really core to ideas about whiteness in the United States, which is a little ironic because it erases the Spanish in Florida. The English were not the first white people in North America, but we'll set that aside. And essentially, the reason why the lost colony is considered lost is because the thing that obviously happened was never considered possible. And that was that the colony assimilated into the surrounding Algonquian society, which is what most historians would now tell you is the most likely thing that happened. That remains relevant to this day because the Lumbee tribe, who counts the lost colony of Roanoke among their ancestors, are the largest tribe east of the Mississippi, and yet they do not have full federal recognition as a tribe. The United States government does not legally recognize the Lumbee like they recognize other tribes across this continent. And that's because the way that laws were set up, particularly in the 1930s, but also before that, around who does and does not count as Native American, essentially dictate that Native people can only become less Native over time, that the direction of assimilation only goes from Indian to less Indian, and that this thing that actually happened all over the continent over a large period of time of non-Native people, of white people, of black people, of other tribes assimilating into particular tribal groups is not legible to the way that we legislate Native identity. And so the Lumbee are really like fascinating to me because they get at these ways that Native people and the ways that we can and cannot be seen as Native actually illuminate core ideas about assimilation, about colonization, about race, about myth, about whiteness, that actually get at something broader in the American story, not just about us, but about what it is to be on this land. There are other dimensions of their story that also make them really fascinating. I'm not gonna go into all of them, but essentially like they are consequential political actors as well. And they are arguably the reason, at the same time as they tell this story about one of their ancestors who led like a a guerrilla movement against the white power structure at the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction. They also, statistically, like, have helped Donald Trump win North Carolina because Donald Trump showed up and said, like, if you vote for me, I'm gonna give you federal recognition. And by the way, it looks like he might actually deliver on that promise. So it's just a fascinating story that I think gets at the kaleidoscope of not just indigeneity on this continent, but what it is to be any kind of person on this continent.
Yeah, I mean, I like that story really resonated. I mean, with having some family members that are part Lumbee, and I mean, even the story too about the Battle of Sitka. I mean, it was really, I don't know, such an important read. And I always thought that'd make a great movie.
Just so everybody knows, so the Battle of Sitka is, Alaska, right? Have it in your head? Okay. So Alaska was first colonized by the Russians. So the Russians controlled Alaska for like a certain period of time, and they showed up in this place called Sitka, Alaska, that's like in southeast Alaska. It's really beautiful, by the way, and Alaska Airlines flies there if you ever want to go on a vacation. It's an amazingly beautiful place. They have a great jazz festival as well. And these are like, just so you know which kind of native people we're talking about, these are totem pole natives, okay? You guys have that in your mind? Okay, these are the Tlingit people. They're very, they're very rich and proud in their culture. And you and I are both from Washington State. So the native people in Washington State will tell you that like the Tlinkits, they were so powerful, they used to get in their canoes and paddle all the way down the coast to Washington State and like raid the Salish people there. So I was actually on an Alaska Airlines flight over here, and there were 2 Tlinkits on the plane, and I was about to make a joke. I was like, you guys are invading Salish country again, because my people are Salish. And then I was like, wait, there's 2 of them and only 1 of me. Like, I shouldn't say it. Anyways, so the Battle of Sitka, the Russians show up, and the Tlinkits get in a war with them. And they pull this incredible move at the end of this battle where, you know, they're kind of outgunned by the Russians, who have these big ships and everything, where they trick the Russians that they're like going to negotiate some sort of peace deal. And then the Russians eventually come into their fort only to find that the Tlinkits have completely disappeared, and that a conspiracy of ravens, which is the correct terminology for a large group of ravens, has taken up like residence in this fort, which is far out because the Tlingit, one of their sort of clan crests, there's 2 major ones for their entire nation, the eagle and the raven, is the raven. So it's this amazing moment in the history of North America that I would bet you not very many of you had ever heard of. And it gets at all these various ways that like native people have been resisting and potentially, this is one interpretation, been using their powers, so to speak, to survive and to get over on the white man. Because the Russians are now gone and the Tlinkits are still there.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I also I think really beautifully illustrates the way that you approach storytelling and knowledge and history. I mean, I feel often like a question that Native artists, filmmakers, writers get is, who's the audience for this? As though there was, I don't know, just like there's this, you're either Native or you're not Native. And how do we approach non-Native audiences? If we make something for a Native audience, then that means we're cutting off the non-Native audience. Or kind of like vice versa. If you're making something for a non-Native audience, then you're not speaking to Native people because it's just part of this larger structure of storytelling that creates a binary that I don't necessarily think is that simple. And reading through the book, I mean, it's so personal. Like, I mean, your relationship to your father and your mother, and it resonates with me on so many personal levels. It's just, I saw myself so much in those pages, and it broke my heart, but it also made me feel seen in ways that, you know, I don't think I have reading certain Native texts. And then too, it's just like you also, I think, very generously dive into these histories, into these stories, into the humanity that goes with the people living through the repercussions of colonization of the last 400 years. I don't know, like, can you talk a bit about that balance that you, or just your approach to that? I mean,
well, you know, I think that on the most basic level, I always find it ridiculous that broader dominant culture doesn't pay attention to Native stories, because, like, If you show up in any res living room across this continent and just like hang out on any given night when the aunties and the uncles are in the room telling stories about what has happened to them, even within the last week, but like, you know, more broadly in their lives, you're gonna hear some of the most like incredible, outrageous, like sometimes really like tragic stories that you've ever heard in your life. And so from like a pure entertainment value, it is crazy to me that this country still does not pay attention to Native people, because like, I don't know, man, like not that long ago, my people were living in pit houses, and it was like Western Canada in the winter, and there was no TV, there was no like screens, no nothing. And so what did we have to do? We had to like sit around and like banter and tell stories for like many months on end. So we got kind of good at it in our culture. And I would say that that's true of like virtually every other Indigenous culture I've encountered. So that's my feeling about the sort of insider-outsider thing. But I also think that, you know, listen, I can be a little like pointy-headed sometimes too, and I studied with, I went to school here in New York. I went to Columbia University, and one of my professors was this Professor Audra Simpson, who's an amazing political theorist. She wrote this book called Mohawk Interruptus. It is a political theory book, like in the fullest sense. So like if you read it, like you're reading political theory. But it has this really wonderful idea that I think has been influential over the last decade in Indigenous studies of refusal. This idea that like rather than trying to chase what colonial society or the state or whatever way you want to put that, I guess for us it would be like publishers and like distributors or whatever, the cultural gatekeepers want us to tell, that instead we think about what our own people need, what kind of films, what kind of stories, what kind of artwork we owe to them, and to work from that kind of a premise. And I think that, you know, again, working on a documentary that was about the system that laid low our language, our culture, our way of being across this continent at the same time as I was writing this book, deeply shaped the way that I was thinking about what elements of our culture and storytelling I, as a writer, had the responsibility to try to bring back to life on the page.
I mean, that makes me think too of just, you know, the elders that you're talking to, the stories you're getting from your family, from your father, from your mother, from these people that are no longer here anymore, from archival records. Like, how do you deal with, or how do you approach that archive, or also like the gaps, or the things that aren't there, the things that are only alluded to, the spaces that you can only fill with your imagination, your understanding of a greater context? I mean, I imagine that must come up a lot, especially with a process such as this.
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of very old PDFs of like anthropological texts that came out in like the 30s or earlier. And, you know, like it is really true that nobody's visiting these. And I should just say that like at Columbia University, for example, they have a great books course wherein you have to read like Plato and Aristotle and the Iliad and all that sort of stuff. And like, I don't know, like why can't they throw a Coyote Story on there? Like it would only be like 10 or 20 pages of reading. But, you know, I think that the way that I approach that is I try to think about the way that my own people would have approached these kinds of things, you know, when it was a living culture. So in the book, I don't see myself as necessarily like a stenographer of the way that I'm reading these oral histories as they exist in these old ethnographic texts, so much as I see myself as a storyteller in the present who's trying to understand and interpret this tradition, and then think about which pieces of it, you know, are important in our present that deserve to be passed on to the next generation. And there are parts of that, large parts of that are about keeping the tradition true to itself. And then there are other parts of that where, like, I don't know, so for example, in the book, one of the major sections of the book is structured around the story of Coyote leading the salmon up the river and then using them, as I said, to marry into as many villages as he possibly could, because he was up to no good. In the version of that story, there are different interpretations about who the people are who Coyote breaks their dam and leads their salmon up the river. The story begins with these two witches or sisters, or sometimes two kinds of animals that have this fish trap across the river, and they're catching all the salmon and keeping them to themselves, which is like, this is a moral story in part, right? Like the basic message in the story is like, don't catch all the fish and keep them to yourself. That's very bad, which is a good message to people, and we should probably stop catching all the fish and keeping them to ourselves. Like, just in case everybody, I mean, I know we're in New York here, so maybe we're not all aware. The fish are not doing that well all across the world. We are catching a lot of the fish and keeping them all for ourselves, and that's bad. And yet, in the way that that story is told across different traditions, the people who are catching all the fish for themselves differ in various versions of the story that are recorded, like in these ethnographic texts. So I was like, all right, well, there's some disagreement about who these these witches can be. So I'm like, in my version, we're gonna make them two lesbian lovers who are in the midst of debating their open relationship when Coyote comes along and gets himself caught in their fish trap, and then, you know, trickster magic ensues. And I think that that's fair game, because, as I said, my ancestors had different versions of this story. So this is just my interpretation of their various traditions of this story.
I mean, I like that, and I appreciate that when I came across that in the book, because it also removes it from an archival sort of way of looking at our own past and our own stories and our own histories, you know, as they were documented 100 years ago. And it's just like that, again, like humanizes so much about the story of the myth, your family. And I don't know, I guess another thing I was wondering too was just about how you approach the stories with your father, and with the things that you want to share, that you don't want to share, whether that's cultural or personal. Like, how do you navigate those lines and those boundaries and borders that often don't exist as Native people, where often so much of our culture is exposed, and there's a certain entitlements by non-Natives to how they understand our culture and our histories and our own personal histories as well.
You know, I think one of the magical things about nonfiction as opposed to fiction is that nonfiction is the storytelling art form wherein it's about how you choose to live your life as a storyteller and how you choose to observe the world, which, if you think that through from the standpoint of a people whose way of life is imperiled and was almost entirely lost, has somewhat profound implications. You know, as a nonfiction Indigenous storyteller, I feel a responsibility to live essentially an Indigenous way of life that is true to my ancestors and that also brings me closer to my family and my culture, which is why I made the probably a little bit unusual decision to move in with, you know, the dad who left me behind when I was you know, a 28-year-old. And so I think that that was really key to, like, really being present in the life of my family and community while I was telling these stories. And at the same time, you know, I think that, to be honest with you, like, writing the book as compared to bringing, because I was making Sugarcane, the documentary, at the same time as I was writing We Survived the Night. And to me, the version of this that was truly terrifying was bringing cameras into my family's residential school trauma. And as you know, as a filmmaker, like, a camera is like a fairly significant imposition, even once people get sort of used to the camera. And so at the end of the day, I had actually no clue how that was going to go, despite all of the best intentions, and thank God it went well. So what did I do? I took on, like, significant spiritual commitments within my own nation. So every year around the summer solstice, I fast for 4 days and 4 nights in the woods with no food and no water, which, by the way, if you look it up on WebMD, they'll tell you that 3 to 5 days without water is like the human limit. Like, then you're in the potential death zone. So 4 days and 4 nights without any food and water is a long time without any water. Like, your eyes start getting yellow, you don't have any spit in your mouth, like, anyways, you don't want to know the rest of it. You got the idea. And the reason behind that was, like, I really believed that it was important to put that intention into, you don't see that at all in the film, but it was important to put that intention into telling these stories that are painful, that do get at these really difficult things that our own families still do not talk about, and for reason. You know, that is how they've survived, is by forgetting, by erasing those memories in their own lives. And you know, the way that I ended up approaching that was ultimately the way that my elders were instructing me to, which was through ceremony and prayer. And I'm really grateful that I did, because I think that I believe that was part of the reason why it all has turned out okay.
I believe that too, and it's a really wonderful, beautiful book. I think now might be time to open it up for questions. If anyone has a question. raise your hand?
Well, it was kind of random, but I just wondered if your dad actually understood what you were up to and what you wanted from the relationship, why you were there. If he saw the coyote in you, knowing well that he in fact was a coyote himself.
It's a great question. Not until after I showed him Sugarcane and I showed him We Survived the Night. So I think that he was a little bit mystified by the whole thing, but he enjoyed hanging out with me. I wrote a little thing about what it was like to hang out with my dad that's in the New York Times Magazine today. We would like hang out at night and listen, it's legal now, so I'm just gonna say it. We smoke weed. And I'd turn on the recorder and he'd tell me stories and we'd play board games. In particular, my dad has his own house version of Scrabble called Bong Hit Scrabble, wherein the house rule is that after every turn you have to take a rip from the bong. So it's a really, really long game. Very fun though. I recommend it. I think that he understood what we were doing as like hanging out and getting to know each other and healing our relationship in some way, shape, or form, which we did. I consider him one of my best friends. In fact, this is a hand-me-down from my dad. It was hanging up in his studio for a really long time, and every single time I'd go in there, I'd like drop a really intense hit. I'd be like, oh, hey, have you worn that lately? Like, that's super cool, man. And he finally gave it to me this summer, which I think is a general sign of what has happened overall, which he watched Sugarcane after we came back from editing it here in New York. He picked me up from the airport. We went straight home and watched it. No color correction, we hadn't done sound and all that sort of stuff yet. And he was riveted. He was like on the edge of his seat. He was like laughing his ass off at the funny parts. He was crying his eyes out. And afterwards he gave me like a huge hug. And he said, this is incredibly beautiful and I'm so proud of you, which was really meaningful to me because my dad's an artist, and so for him to appreciate, the art that I made was really special. It wasn't until he read We Survived the Night, though, that he and it took him a while to read it, but it wasn't until then that he said, I'm sorry and I understand the ways that I, created pain in your life, which meant the world to me. Oh, and now he's starting to do coyote art too, based upon some of the things in the book, which I was trying to convince him of for many, many years, and now he's finally doing it, which is super cool.
Question down front.
Yeah, I just want to say there's like a lot of young Native people who fucks really heavy with you, and they love you, and I think a lot of folks what is a piece of advice that you would give to young Native people who are looking to write a book or make a film or be just chase their dreams? What is a piece of advice that you would give to your younger self to help young people and inspire them, or maybe kick us down? I don't know, pick one.
Well, firstly, thank you. That's awesome. I love that. I fuck with you guys too. I think believe in yourself. I think as Native people, there are so many reasons for us not to believe in ourselves. We, especially here in the States, we are made to feel like we do not matter every single damn day. And, I rub up against that all the time in my own work. Here I am trying to tell the story of my people, and it's pretty rare that the big institutions that decide what the stories are of the day are like, oh yeah, that is one of our stories of the day. So I think it's really important that we believe in ourselves and we see the value in who we are and what we come from and how powerful and beautiful it is. This entire country, this entire continent is premised on the idea that Native people were bad and backwards and that our way of life needed to die. And I think that the exact opposite is true, that we come from a beautiful way of life. We come from beautiful people. It's in our art, it's in our jewelry, it's in the stories we tell, it's in all these different parts of ourselves. And what I'd also say to young Native people is listen to your elders, man. I know that they sometimes can be a little difficult, but they have important things to teach us. And that is a really big part of our culture too.
We had a question over here.
Hi. I had a question regarding so in your documentary, when you were speaking with your dad about his experiences with residential schools, or maybe different relatives and their experiences, they're often like, I see this also in my own family, and like staying with my grandma and seeing kind of like the effects, whether like emotional, psychological, of like what's happened from a young age across like many generations, and like the sensitivity with that. And I wonder like if you have any advice or perspectives of like how to speak to the elders that went through this collective trauma, and like maybe whether that's for understanding yourself, or if you have questions like as younger generations about what like the truth of like what happened, and also maybe like helping in some way to like speak it out loud or to heal in some way for them as well, because I think they have a lot of trauma like holding it in, and also like going through it at a young age and being, you know, abused physically, mentally, verbally. It causes this kind of reaction to certain things. And I don't know, I've been wondering about like how to bridge that gap kind of between the generations, and also like asking about cultural things that were suppressed. Maybe it's not spoken out loud as much, you know, and there's like this fear of like hurting each other in some way. I don't know. Yeah.
So, you know, one of the things that I heard repeated in kind of liberal media after the discovery of the 200 potential unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which some of you guys might remember, it was like a New York Times notification, was that like Native people had been talking about this, and that like broader white society hadn't been listening, which when I heard that, I was like, that's not true. That's not what was happening in my family, in my community. Like, we never talk about the residential schools, you know? And so I think a big part of what I was trying to understand with my co-director, Emily Cassie and Sugarcane, was why this silence about this history, you know, was being perpetuated not just by like the church and the government, you know, the actors who you might expect to not want to talk about this thing, but why that silence also existed within my own family. Because, you know, I spent a couple summers on the Cannon Lake Res learning Secwépemc from NoiseCat, and if you're learning the language that was literally beaten out of your grandmother at a residential school, eventually you're going to ask, like, hey, like, what happened to that school? And it became very clear to me on the couple times that I tried to ask her that like it was not something she wanted to talk about. And so I think a big part of what I was trying to understand and then come to terms with and make peace with was the fact that there are some parts of that experience that were so awful, that were so painful, that people still carry so much shame and guilt around, which, by the way, the Catholic Church is really good at making people feel those things, that, you know, they can't talk about it, or that the way that they survive is by not talking about it. And then, you know, I'm also really interested in, like, what makes it possible for people to, like, break through some of those silences. And some people aren't. You know, the truth of the matter is that my grandmother is as depicted in the film. You know, she, to this day, knows what the film is about, knows what I'm doing out here in the world, and still doesn't talk about the residential school. And that is like our relationship, and we're cool and we love each other, and her and my dad are way closer because of everything that we did. And at the same time, like, I don't expect us to ever sit down and have like a conversation about like, okay, this is what happened at the schools, this is what happened when your father was born, all that sort of stuff. And I think that I have made peace with that. And so I think that part of what I was trying to communicate, and with my co-director again, Emily Cassie, on that film, and also with We Survived the Night, is why some of these silences exist in our own family, which I think is something important for people in my generation, in our generation, who are the grandchildren often of that experience, to understand why our elders are that way, and how that is how they've survived.
Wait, hold on.
One
Right
more.
there, right there,
Here.
right there.
Gotta get
Yeah,
her,
right there.
man. You
All right, thank you. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I mean, I'm the Coyote stories go all the way to Central America, and I was curious about like how you encountered those stories, and like what's a good way to like access those stories? Is it something you just Google and like look up Coyote stories? And like, what's a good way to like access those stories? Is it something you just Google and like look up Coyote stories? questions and then read up on it?
I spent a lot of time on Google Scholar. And if you can figure out a way to get an access to a JSTOR account through some sort of institution, JSTOR is pretty good. Yeah, I mean, you know, these things exist piecemeal in different ways, and I can't say that I'm much of I'm not particularly knowledgeable about how you'd learn about Central America. I'll just speak to how I learned more about my own people's coyote stories. So there was this big anthropological expedition in the late 1800s called the Jessup North Expedition. It was actually run by this guy, Franz Boas, who was from Columbia and the American Museum of Natural History. He's considered like the father of modern anthropology. It turns out he got a lot of his ideas from like his native interlocutors, actually. Whoa, crazy thing. The ideas came from the Indians. That's wild. And so in those texts, there was his main ethnographer in our area was this guy named James Tate, who was actually pretty cool, especially for an ethnographer. He had married into one of our communities. He was like a badass guider, so he like actually really knew the land. And he ultimately became so involved in our struggle to get our land back that he started like shirking his anthropological responsibilities, and Boaz was like getting a little annoyed at him about this because he became a secretary for our like organizations that were trying to advocate to the crown and to the prime minister to like do something about the fact that the entire province of British Columbia was taken from First Nations without any treaties or any form of recompense. And so his texts are super helpful. And I think essentially what I would say is like, not all of the ethnographers are as cool as Tate. We had the coolest anthropologists, man. But I think finding those kinds of sources, usually, like it seems to me like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was like a lot of ethnographies happening all over the native world. And so I'd go on, if I was you, I'd just go on Google Scholar and start poking around.
Get a JSTOR account.
Hi. So I feel like I resonated a lot with you and your writing. I'm of Syrian and Palestinian descent, but the only difference is I was born in the U.S. and I've never been on Palestinian land, and I've only ever spent like a month or two at a time in Syria, and I haven't been back in years. And also for context, I'm in Josh's writing place class at NYU, and we've read some of your other work. And so I was curious, in writing about place and in writing, if I wanted to write about my heritage, my background, how do you anchor yourself in a place that maybe you haven't spent any or lots of time in, and when your only reference is like, my parents and, stories from family and things you see and on, in the news and stuff. I just want to be able to like do justice to a place that is very important to me, but I can't like immerse myself in like a conventional way.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you, Josh, for teaching my work. That's so cool.
My honor.
I think that I'll say that I come from in a certain sense, a little bit of like a privileged context in that like, in North America, our people aren't living in like a war-torn situation wherein like you can't return to your ancestral homelands. There's lots of bad things happening in this country, but at the end of the day, like I can still drive back to Cannon Lake in Canada. So I would also say though that Native people here in North America, we're never really seen this way, but we also are kind of a diasporic people in the sense that today, 80% or something like that of Native people in the United States live in cities or in urban contexts, which is not how we're often seen. And I think that, like, for example, I grew up in Oakland, California. I would go to this urban Indian community center called the Intertribal Friendship House. It's the third oldest urban Indian community center in the country. Has a really interesting history, was involved, for example, in organizing the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz, which is like a really important moment when Native people started to reclaim our rights and our culture and our self-determination, all that sort of stuff. And so I think that like finding those kinds of places where people have chosen in a context beyond, their home, their reservation, to like come together and retain and reclaim who we are. I think that those places can be really, really magical. And one of the things that's most interesting to me about like that era in Native culture and movement and politics is that arguably like the resurgence of our people didn't really come actually from what was going on the reservations, but came from places like the Bay Area, from places like Minneapolis, from places like Seattle, where actually, in fact, where Sky shot his film, Powwow People, Daybreak Star, the origin of that spot is because the native people in Seattle, like urban Indians in Seattle, reclaimed this park in Seattle, and unlike the Indians in the Bay Area, I guess, so you guys have one up on us, they like actually succeeded at holding on to it, and now there's like a native cultural center there, and they have like a really cool powwow. Sky shot a movie that's going to win a lot of awards there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think finding those kinds of places can help when you can't necessarily go home.
I'm sorry to say, we could do this all night, I think we've sort of come to when we need to let Julian go sign books and for you all to go home with books, and you can ask more questions, I think, in line. Please stick around, have a drink, hang out. Please go home with a book. But most importantly, please join me in thanking Julian Brave, NoiseCat, Sky Hopinka, and Laura Ortman. We survived the night. Thank you, guys.